I always say to people, mirror what's in front of you. So if the person is quiet and wants to just be, just still or rest, or just mirror that so that you can give them the space to be that. If they're feeling suddenly they've got energy, don't say, I think you should rest. Go with the energy. So then, should we go out? Should we take a drive? Should we take a walk? So match and mirror the energy that's present. And that's being heard and seen. And the person will feel so supported by that.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Ask Julie Ryan Show. I have such a treat for you today. I have an absolutely extraordinary woman named Janie Brown. Welcome, Janie.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Oh, gosh, my honor. You guys are going to love this woman. This is the first time I've met her, but I know a lot about her and I love her already. So you'll see why when we get into the conversation. Let me tell you a little bit about Janie. Janie Brown was raised in Scotland and educated with a master's in psychology at St. Andrews University and a master's in nursing at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. She worked for many years as an oncology nurse and clinical nurse specialist at BC Cancer in Vancouver. And then in 1995, inspired by the Cancer Help Program at Commonweal, she founded the Callanish Society, a grassroots nonprofit organization for people living with and dying from cancer. Callanish is also based in Vancouver. Janie's book, Radical Acts of Love, How We Find Hope at the End of Life, was published in 2020. So I have questions for you, my girl. I have many questions for you because my husband affectionately calls me an information suck. So
got it.
I'm one of those naturally curious people who just wants to know. Here's my first one. Tell us about Callanish and tell us why you named it Callanish. Am I pronouncing it right?
It's actually Callanish.
Callanish, okay.
Yeah, Callanish, but in the Gaelic, it's Callanay, spelled differently. So it's a wonderful word, actually. And I think that's where the origin of choosing the name Callanish for our nonprofit organization. There are many charities that work with people with cancer. And so I didn't necessarily want the word cancer because of the kind of work we do. Cancer is the disease that, of course, opens everybody to the experience of living through, incredible challenges that go along with the treatment of cancer. But it's not the whole story. And I think that this move toward, finding what healing means in the midst of a diagnosis of cancer, or indeed at the end of life, what does healing look like? I didn't necessarily want, Callanish to have the Callanish Cancer Society, because again, I think it puts the focus on the medicalization of this illness, which is extremely important. The treatment of cancer and the conventional system is required, obviously, for this illness, but there's so much more to it. So when as you said, I'm originally from Scotland, and that's my heritage all the way back, both generations. But my mother was born in Canada, so I ended up with citizenship. When we were thinking, what can we call this? I mean, names are so interesting, aren't they? I love you're just Julie Ryan. That's just up, really clear. But we discovered this name Callanish through sort of a serendipitous, but I knew there was a place called Callanish. But the word is so beautiful to me. It's so soft, and yet it's got this kind of a strength to it, at least how I perceive that word. So when this word came to me through someone else, and then I, looked up, of course, Callanish, the place, which is in the northern tip of the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, which is a chain of islands down the northwest coast, and the top island's called Lewis, the island of Lewis, and it has the largest standing stone circle in the UK, which is almost unheard of. I mean, this place isn't really, it's not like Stonehenge or these other Glastonbury, other places people go, but I've always been drawn to these places of mystery. And to me, that place with these beautiful, I think there's 52 stones, but there's a beautiful circle of standing stones, and then in the center there's one tall stone. And then there's actually a sort of a cross with 4 pathways of stones. So to me, the mystery of a 5,000-year-old stone circle that we really still have no idea what they were doing there, other than that they were doing ceremony and ritual and working with the astronomy. Actually, it's connected to the moon, the site of Callanish, and so every 28 years the full moon comes down to a place in the circle where it kind of joins the stones. It's a really beautiful to look at picture. So all of those reasons, I thought, I just really, the mystery of healing and the mystery of life and death is, it's always been very dear to my heart for some reason. I think I came in with that desire to sort of understand, what are we doing here and how do we live with these kind of tragedies and make them into, something that we can live and live as best we can. So that's the word Callanish. And to me, it's actually become a bit of a pilgrimage site now for people who come, to retreat. And what does Callanish mean? And then, let's go on an adventure. And actually, I've been there 3 times now. The first time was with my mother. And when I left the site, I saw a huge owl fly across my windshield. It's a very barren and quite bleak place, wind and grasses and a little village there. But when I came around the corner the first time and I saw this circle of stones on the hill, I just had a kind of quickening. My heart was, when you get kind of, what is this? And I could feel the place and all its history. And when I put my hand on the first standing stone, I just had this experience of all the thousands of people before me that had put their hand on that particular stone. And in Scotland, they're unearthing these stone circles over, it's really phenomenal. So that's a long answer to your question. I know you've got lots of questions, so I'll stop there. But it's been a name that's really holds a lot of presence and power, I think, from this mystery and the circle, which is very much how we work in the circle with people.
Isn't it older than some of the pyramids too?
Actually, that's a good question. That was another place I went to because I wanted to stand in front of those pyramids. And so I actually don't know, but they're 5,000 years old. So they're 3,000 BC. So again, my history, I should know how old the pyramids, maybe you do, but I don't have that in the top of my head. But yeah,
I think it's about the same time. I think the ones in Egypt are like 5,000 or 6,000.
Yeah, they probably
years old.
are. I mean, they all carry this kind of mystery of why were they doing this, and what were they doing, and why did they deliberately create these systems that in our world right now we don't, there's something lost, I think, in understanding the relationship with both the cosmos and then kind of the stone. I mean, the indigenous people would call them the stone people, that they are really powerful presence. So I just enjoy that, learning about those places. Yeah.
And how did they get them erected and how did they move them there and all of that? Because we think they didn't have the technology that we have. It would be difficult for us to do it even in today's world, but how did they do it back then?
That's just, you kind of try and visualize that. You think,
Yeah.
And there's these photographs in the little museum there that, of these people, with these, long dresses, the women are, they're standing at these stones. I think, what did they look like 5,000 years ago? We didn't have cameras then. So I find that mystery, that kind of mystery, enlivening in some way. And I think then the mystery of death can even be that way, which sounds strange. And that's something we'll talk more about, obviously. But
yeah. Well, along those lines, you say illness can enrich somebody's life. How so? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I think it's not something you ever, want in your life because of what it brings, and just, the challenges of how to face into not just the, the rigorous treatments, surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, but also just where it takes you out of the life that you've constructed into very quickly for most people, into a different kind of life. And so in that life, of course, is all the, again, as I said, the challenges of that. But there's also something else that's often uncovered. And I wouldn't say for everyone, because I think we all have different paths, but for many people, it's really like a reckoning, about, wow, how am I going to live with this, that this has happened to what I thought was a healthy body, into this situation. And I think it in that way that we can do. I mean, I think this is so true of our lives, isn't it? When we meet at crossroads, it can be anything, and often comes through these challenges that we get to look at ourselves and our lives differently. And I suppose that's what our organization, that I developed almost 30 years ago with a team, was who this is what these people who want to look and say, what now? What is my life? How am I going to live with fear and uncertainty and worry and fear of death, and make something of my life, and wake up to the life that I've been given, without it being, it's an epiphany. It's not like that. I think it's the work of that. How do we actually really look inward and say, what am I going to do with this life now? It becomes more precious and more pressing in a way when we all know we're finite. You do so much work in this area. So, we all know that there's an expiry date, so to speak, but we don't really take it in. A lot of people don't take it in fully, and therefore know that this is this breath, and then this breath, and then the last breath. So, it really is, there is a beginning and an end to our incarnation in this life. So I think what I like to think about is, how do we enhance and build up the aspects of self that I think have often gone missing in the life that we construct. So some people come on our retreats and they say, I haven't laughed for a year. Or, I remember I used to love walking in the forest and I forgot, I got too busy. Or, I used to play, the violin. I haven't done that for 30 years. So it reawakens some of the aspects of self that I think we need. I mean, I think they are who we are. So cancer can be a gateway for those conversations in the inner world. And then I suppose what we want to provide is a place for people to do that discovery, to discover, what are these aspects of myself that I could really bring up, so that I have those with me when I have to face the rigors of this disease, and this, for some, the end of their life.
I think some people figured that a little bit of that out during the pandemic
Yeah,
too,
I think so
because
too.
it let them slow down a little bit. And
Mm-hmm.
I know that people were saying that they always said, I wish I had more time with my family, or I wish I had more time
Yeah,
to read a book, or I wish
right,
I had more time to do whatever. And
right.
they were afforded that
Yes,
with the
exactly.
pandemic
Yeah,
situation.
yeah, exactly.
So
Yeah.
similar.
Mm-hmm.
Back to your growing up in Scotland, I always think of Scotland as a land of deep spirituality, with the Celts and the Druids and King
Right.
Arthur's Round Table and Merlin the Magician and all of
Yeah.
that. Most people think that King Arthur's Round Table happened in England, but research is showing that it looks like it happened in Scotland
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
instead. And I
Yeah.
find that fascinating.
Yeah.
Is there anything from your childhood growing up in Scotland that's made a mark on you to the point where you included it into what you teach today
Mm-hmm.
about the end of life and how to live life, whether you have a terminal illness or not? Is there,
Mm-hmm.
I would think some of it's got to be in your DNA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And how does it surface? One of my favorite quotes about Ireland was, there was an American archaeologist there, and he was just talking to random people, and he said, "Do you believe in fairies?" And one woman said, "No, sir, I do not, and they're everywhere." So I think that whole magical spiritual thing
Yeah.
of England and Ireland and Wales and Scotland and all of that is
Mm-hmm.
very specific to that part of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, I wasn't one of the people that had, a very a difficult loss early in life. People think, that you come to this work through your own experience. So I think I do feel the lineage of that I carry, and I can't describe that very well in words. But I suppose the closest, the Celts are kind of a feisty lot. They really, I mean, they really are. And I feel like I carry some of the kind of resoluteness of them. But there's also this magical world. And my grandmother, my mother's mother, who was kind of a dour woman. Like, she wasn't like, oh, my lovely grandchildren. She was a bit scary. And so was my grandfather. They're kind of like, okay, outside and play. It was really, it wasn't like I see grandparents nowadays, but again, there was a fascination, and we used to go down. They lived in Oxford, and I used to go down there every summer with my family. I have 3 siblings, my parents. And she used to say to me, and she always just said it to me. She said, okay, well, today we'll go to the fairy circles, because there's fairy circles all over that are known to many people. And I used to wait, and I used to ask her every day, can we go today? And she'd be like, nope, not today.
What's a fairy circle?
Well, it's actually a place where fairies live. There's a fairy dell, and so of course, we have these images in our mind, because I can't see fairies. I really wish I could. I had a mentor, Dora Kuntz, who was an amazing clairvoyant woman who was head of the Theosophical Association in the US. And she used to work with energy, and she could see. She's actually written a book called The Book of Fairies. And I've read that book many times. I think, oh, I really wish I could see. But there are places that people who can see know that that's where the fairies live. So I used to go with her down the path, and I say, are we nearly there? And she'd say, not yet. And we just walk and walk. And then we get there, and she'd say, we're here. And of course, as a child, you're like, where are they? I can't see them. But she commanded this sort of knowing, it was really beautiful. So she just said, this is where they live. And so it's almost like I could conjure them up, because I could feel the place. So I think I come from that. I wouldn't say I had no idea who she really was in her being. She was actually one of the first women physicians at Glasgow University, in the first class of female physicians. And she worked for the Red Cross during the war. So I know she came from that kind of healing background. But I don't have any, other than what I sense and feel, which is a lot. I don't have the data, so to speak, that I came from, something that, but I definitely over the years have felt that more and more. And I feel such a kinship to, I always say I live in 2 countries. I've been in Canada for almost 40 years now, but my mother, who just died 4 months ago, was in Glasgow right up until she died. And so I've been back there, and my sisters live in London. And so I have a very strong connection to that. But I suppose with spirituality, it's interesting with the Celts, and I haven't wanted to, I've delved into many kinds of teachings, but I'm always wary to put an overlay of too much belief, like to create sort of go into the structure of something, and then it becomes my own. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but so I've wanted to more feel it and learn it through my own experience, I suppose. What is my relationship? So I know that my roots are very strong there, and I will continue to go back there. And and I keep meeting people. People appear at the door. Yesterday, this lovely young Irishman. Oh, I'm working at end of life, and you just there's a gathering of the clan wherever we live. I think. Sure, you feel that too for your own. Who comes to you and how, and it's also interesting.
Well, the fairies appear to me looking like Tinkerbell, just because that's what I was taught fairies look like by Walt Disney, certainly. And they have magic wands, and they put little sparkles around. When my grandsons were little and they were losing their teeth, the tooth fairy came to visit them.
Yes.
And there's a botanical garden near our home that has a fairy village that's built out of twigs and I don't know, leaves and sticks and stuff like that. And so when they'd lose a tooth, we'd go visit the tooth fairy at the fairy village to thank them for bringing $1. And I'd say, and their imaginations just go wild, because I'd say, okay, now it's daytime. They're asleep because they work at night bringing money to the kids who've lost a tooth. And I'd take them, and they're all teenagers now. One's starting college. And they still talk about Fairy Village.
I know.
So it sinks in there.
Yeah, it's in there. Exactly. It's in there.
It's in there. Do you find when somebody's faced with a terminal diagnosis that sometimes the family's fear is greater than the patient's?
Mm, definitely. I mean, I think that depends on the stage of things. Often the diagnosis itself, it's say a stage 4, a very serious cancer. I think the person who receives that news in their body, it's their body, that there's a certain process they go through of, shock, especially if it's come as a surprise. And then they go through various stages of working through or not, or just living with all of these stages of grief and loss and fear and all these things, this emotional landscape that I've always been very curious about, how people do that. How do they do that? So then the family often takes their cues from the person. So they have their own experience, the family members, but then they kind of take their leadership from the person often, and that can go really well, and it can also be very difficult because depending on often it's the relationship with anxiety. I notice that can really influence a family so much. If there's been a history of, so much, everybody gets really anxious and really worried. And so that can really affect the person with cancer trying to find their way, trying to find is it even possible to feel peace in the midst of this, or even joy? How do you do that? But then if they're surrounded by a family that has so much angst, or so much, or previous history of illness in their family that's not gone so well. We bring, of course, our whole life to those experiences, and then we act out of those if we haven't got enough awareness to know we're doing that. So I think the family, there's a very interesting thing that happens where, again, it depends. The relationship to hope is such an interesting one, because the family often feels that it's their job to hold the hope somehow. And so they often say to me, well, if I open up the conversation about dying with my loved one, then somehow it's going to communicate to them that I'm giving up hope, which of course is not really the point, right? So when you say give up hope, you can say, well, give up hope that you're going to live a long time, or do we continue to hold hope? So there's a kind of relationship of protection that happens, and you see this a lot around children as well. Obviously, we try and protect one another from pain. So families do often a good job of that, trying to protect their loved one. But the loved one saying, I don't want that protection. I want openness. I want to be able to talk about this difficult time in my life. And so those are where things get really thwarted, the communication, because everyone's in a way pretending, oh, this is going to be okay. This is going to be fine. And if it's not going to be fine, how do they build the muscle? How do they build the muscle to learn how to communicate about difficult things? And it depends so much on the family, doesn't it? If the family has a history of working through things together, then I see these families do such a beautiful job of, we got to talk about this hard stuff. What's going to happen? How are we going to do that as a family? What work do we have to do together to make this as good a time as it can be, given the tragedy of it? So I think families really interest me, actually, because I've worked so much with the whole family, and I think it's such a, I often say to the person who's ill, it is up to you in a way to lead people into those conversations, because you feel scared to. Families feel scared to say, should we talk about this sort of, this subject that we've pushed so far away in our Western world anyway. It's not so true in many cultures, in our country, but, we've pushed away death so far that we don't have a familiarity anymore with it. I was raised to have our grandparents in our home when they died. So that's maybe the answer to your question that you asked me. I saw my grandmother, die in our home as a child while I was a teenager. And so that familiarity is what we've lost. I mean, I meet people who are 60, 70, have never seen anyone die. So no wonder there's such a terror, and no wonder we've disempowered ourselves to say we can do this in families. There is a way to accompany our families. And we've medicalized it so much. We've taken away the energy and the strength in a family to actually help a loved one through the end of life. And that sorrow, it gives me a lot of sorrow, that because, throughout time, before we even had hospitals, we were doing that. And I'm glad for the things we do have now that we didn't have then, such as, pain management and ways to make people more comfortable. But people really don't believe they have what they need to help a loved one through the end of life. And I do think we all have that as humans, if we can get the coaching or the role modeling. I often say to people, well, go and be a hospice volunteer, learn about what is death like? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What can you do in it? And, that's an amazing place to get training and understanding of death, rather than, we'll just wait till it happens and then we'll deal with it. I often say that about birth. You can wait till you go into labor to figure out where you're going to be and who's your team. But of course, that doesn't really work very well. So in death, we think, well, we'll just figure it out when we get there. But it doesn't go very well when we do that, sadly. So you can stop me anytime. I do tend to talk.
Yeah. Oh, it's fascinating. What you touched on it a little bit, that you think end of life has been medicalized. One of my favorite hospice doctors is Chris Kerr in Buffalo.
Oh.
And he says end of life care is an assembly line of the absurd, which I think is so appropriate. And how did we get there? How did we go from knowing as a family, as a culture, how to deal with death, how to help people, our loved ones, to where we are now? And is it because a lot of physicians are afraid to talk about death?
That's such a good question. I mean, I've thought about that question so much. What happened? And I do think the development of the experts, which of course is a brilliant thing. We've got experts who know how to do a lot of really important things. But then I think what that does is it separates us as humans, that we're all going to face this end of life. I mean, not everyone will give birth, but everyone will be born and everyone will die. So we create a group of experts. And how those experts lead the way. I mean, this is why the hospice and palliative care movement's been so important, because those experts decided that's going to be my expertise, which thank goodness, because they really are leading. But again, such a small percentage of people get the benefit of hospice or palliative care. I think it's something like less than 10% of people die in a hospice or have hospice care at home. So I think I really like to think that we can relearn what we've lost. That would be my hope. And that's, I think, what we're so much trying to do here, is we're trying to teach people that you have what you need to be with the person that you love, and with all the sorrow. And, it's not like you have to be there as a stoic, strong person. You can learn to care and be present with all of that. So it's, I have to feel hopeful that we can get there, but it's certainly, I love what you just said about the absurd. That is so much how I feel. When I hear these stories about what happens to people, especially the elderly, we're just in a real pickle with what we're doing at the end of life, feeding people who don't want food. And, there's just there's something, I think very, I love the word, so I'm going to use the word absurd about how we got here. And this fountain of youth, that this whole movement of, that we don't treat our elders as elders. We treat our elders as, we shun them in some way. So I'm very sad where we are, but I do have a lot of hope that people really want to know how to do this. They want to learn how to communicate, and they want to be able to be present all the way through for their loved ones, but they just don't really know how. So it's really quite basic, the knowledge to say, yeah, just sit there, read a book, read out loud, just be yourself. Because I think, again, the experts take away that humanness, even at the bedside. I walk into rooms and there's the family are standing in the corner, I'm thinking, come in, come closer. It's not, you don't need to be so scared, but you need someone to say, well, what is the symptom and what does that mean? If this person is in this state, what does it mean? So we have a lot of relearning. I think we did all know this, and many cultures know this today. In our world today, many cultures are much more familiar and up close with death than the Caucasian, the Western world, where we're struggling, I think, to find our way back. And in so many ways, I think we're struggling to find our way back, but we also need to move forward.
Well, fortunately, I believe that the baby boomer generation, of which you and I are a part, we're fascinated with this, and we want to figure out, okay, what do we need to do? And we're the first generation since our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents who question medical experts.
Right.
And we say, okay, you're saying this, but my mom's 95 and you want to do chemo and radiation on her. And why do we want to put her through that?
Exactly. Yeah.
And we have the wherewithal and the strength and the courage to say, that just doesn't feel right. Let me look in to see what else is going on, and really be an advocate for our elderly and our loved ones who are ill, to help them make decisions.
Exactly.
And people like you are educating the world. So one of the reasons why, as I mentioned, I think you're so extraordinary in the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
When someone's diagnosed, I've heard you say that you believe a portion of our humanity goes underground. Is that what you're talking about? That the fear takes over and the...
Yeah, I mean, I think the survival instinct that we're hardwired for, the body's survival for obvious reasons. So then I think we click into that survival mode and we forget a lot of these parts of ourselves that we actually need at a time like that. So yes, I think fear can take over, anxiety, and then the rigors of what's required of you every day to get up out of bed and go in and have a chemotherapy treatment that seems to many people like, why am I putting the nurse's gown and mask up, and then to put this chemical in your body, so there's all this absurdity about that too, so what does that feel like to go and receive treatment? That, I mean, and really does cure a lot of people. There are many people who are cured by these these drugs and these, but again, you're right. There's a broadening that's happening as well. But yes, I do think that we have people when they arrive at the doors of our retreat. We do a 5-night retreat. They're so tired from the journey of that, just the brutality of having to go and deal with this disease. So they come just ready to, unload. First of all, the first step is they unload their grief, usually the sorrow that's been there from the moment of diagnosis, where life changed forever, really. Even if they are cured from their disease, they always have the knowledge that their body, somehow cancer grew in their body. So could that happen again? So that's that ongoing relationship you have with your body and with cancer, even when you've had a good long survival. So it's always there. So I think that this if you can actually offload in a safe place with people who aren't giving you advice and telling you what you should do and what you should eat and how you should feel, if you can really be in a place that says, just be yourself, tell us your story, you can literally unpack and unload some of those burdens. And then, of course, underneath those burdens or those issues are the life story of things that have happened before that haven't been allowed a place to be seen or heard, or you haven't found a place that you could do that. So all of that's I think this very powerful process of allowing and naming, what's inside, and to put it into a safe place with witnesses to say, okay, I'm not going to tell you that that's right, wrong, good, bad. I'm just going to hear your story. And then what happens is this energy, which I think is the energy of life, life force actually comes in behind that, sort of emptying out of these, some people at the last retreat, someone said, I've never told anyone this story. And I'm telling it now because it's here and I want to tell it. So then I believe that creates an energy in the body that then opens out. You know all about this. I'm telling you things you already know, but in my words, they may be different than yours. So then the body starts to open those places of holding. And I think then the remembering starts to happen. Oh, I can still, I don't know, do whatever. I can be myself. I used to cook. Haven't cooked for ages. Oh, I feel like going out. People start to naturally wake up to these parts that I think you forget. I mean, we all forget through our life, don't we? We kind of pack on, because we construct the lives that we live. And so I think we need those aspects of ourselves really to be able to live through these kind of illnesses and to face the end of life. And I always think if you could meet yourself again, really, maybe you've never met yourself before, if you could really know who you are, then it's possible to step over that threshold between life and death. And I see that with the work people do. They get the sense that I know how to do that. I always say the body knows how to die. I mean, it actually is wired. It's wired to come in. I mean, the woman has to give birth, but the baby is the one that actually comes in. I mean, I'd love to talk to you more about your thoughts on all this, but so in death, the same, you go into the death canal. I think of it very similarly, and there's an intelligence. And so there's an intelligence to know how to do that. So we don't think we know how to do that. But I've watched so many people die that I know that we all have that intelligence. So that's a deep reassurance in a way that we'll know when it's our time, how to do it. Our bodies know, but in what we were just talking about, then if the system goes against that intelligence and says, oh, but we should still give you food, and your body's saying, I don't really want food, then there's kind of, it gets all mucked up in there. But now I do really believe we have that capacity. And thank goodness we have communities of support to make sure your body can be comfortable through the palliative system, hospice system. But I think we do know how to leave. And I think we know more. We're not so caught up with these stories of our past if we can do that work now, if we can do it before. Because I see people, suffer and struggle at the end of life. And it's these stories that they've never often, and you get little fragments of story that I think, oh, there's a big story there. I'd love that person to be able to just lay the story down, and then there's something can happen for them. So I suppose that's my mission, if I have one. I don't know if I have a mission, but I want people to be relieved enough to know who they are and find their way to in life to that point, and then be as prepared as possible, which isn't always possible because of suddenness of death and all of those things we also know happen.
I have a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, disease sometimes is the catalyst to get us to look at, okay, I have a finite amount of time left.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How do I want to spend it?
Mm-hmm.
And there's always an emotional component. It's been my experience. There's always an emotional component in place before any kind of medical situation arises.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And one of I believe the most important part of an energetic healing, as I do them with spirit working through me and with me, is normally at the end of a session with someone, we'll explore that. And I'll see an actual event and I'll get a year. And if it's past life, we'll get that. And once we illuminate where that energy block began, it eradicates it instantly, which is what you're talking about they're doing when they tell their stories.
Right.
It eradicates it instantly. It helps the body regain and maintain health. And sometimes the healing is death.
Right. Yeah.
And the other thing that's interesting too is research shows, and it's been my experience, that's what my angelic attendance book is about, research shows that 90% of people at the end of their lives see the spirits of deceased loved ones and pets as they're approaching death, either in visions or dreams. And I find when I talk to people about that who are experiencing that real time, they are so relieved because perhaps they've spent decades in some instances feeling guilty about treating a parent a certain way or a sibling or a friend or an ex-spouse or somebody like that. And that person's spirit's there to support them as they're dying and to welcome them to what I call heaven. And I think it's the same thing going on as what you're talking about with the stories is they feel such a sense of comfort and release and relief, actually, as well as they're doing that. Have you experienced that with your patients?
Yes. What you're describing about people speaking, well, I just experienced it with my mother, where 2 weeks before she died, she was talking, definitely. And there was a man sitting on the chair in her room. But my experience is not always people we know. And that's very interesting. And you probably have something to say about that. She didn't know this man. But I said, is he friendly? And she said, yeah, he's friendly. And then there was a cat, and she's actually allergic to cats. So I find it all quite interesting that the people that come to attend, if that's how you describe that, I think that's quite beautiful. That strangers, I think about, often when I step into that first retreat and I've never met these people, I think, wow, we can get so close to strangers, like within, so quickly. We've never met, but I've certainly watched you, and I can feel a kinship. So it's amazing how quickly. So isn't that lovely thought that there's this lovely man that came? And then my mother, who was such, just to get a kick out of that, she's such an atheist. Like she just really, her, as she said, nature was her God, which I understand more as a pagan. But she said, like 2 days before she died, she said, "Oh, I think I'm going to go to church." And I said, "You are?" And she said, "Yeah. And I'm going to wear black." And I said, "Mom, you were a member of the church and you left the church." And she said, "Yeah." I said, "Why are you going?" And she said, "Well, I think I have something to learn. I still think I have something to learn. I want to find out what it's all about." And I just thought that was so fun. And then you'll get a kick out of this. About a few hours later, through our front door, this was at her home in Glasgow. I was there through her death at home. And the elder from the church, who's never come to her house since my father died a long time ago, put a little flyer through the door about, the church just a few hours after so either she felt him coming, I don't know. It was very interesting. So I hear a lot of stories about, and I've seen that and often there's a mumbling, so you can't necessarily hear what people are saying. But I love the way to engage with people and ask, you can go into conversation just with this kind of openness. Who are you talking to, and who's here? And there's often a response, but I think sometimes we have to be willing to go into that conversation because people are often so, "Oh, what's going on?" And the person's hallucinating, and well, maybe they're hallucinating, but maybe there's something happening that is, we could be curious about, which I just love. I like the idea of this man sitting. She wasn't scared of him, so if she was scared of him, I'd probably tell him to shove off. But it's nice to think of that.
It's most likely somebody from a past life, because when the spirits start to congregate, and I can see them telepathically when I'm working with somebody, I can see them in the room and I can describe what they look like. And Janie, it's so fun because they show up like in period dress. There may be people from the Renaissance and people dressed like Twiggy from the 1960s with go-go boots and mini skirts. And really the cat most likely was a pet in a prior life.
Yeah, interesting.
And the difference between hallucination and also the spirits that are there at the end of life is the spirits that are there to welcome them are very comforting. Whereas when somebody's hallucinating, and you know this from your medical background, it's distressing to them.
That's right. It's comforting. It's definitely that. I had a picture of him, so I don't know if it was just my imagination, but I saw him as a farmer, like with a tweed cap on, and I don't know if that was just me imagining that, and then I thought, well, her family were farmers,
Sure.
Yeah, of course,
Sure.
everyone's family were farmers, but he was just a solid kind of, just the way she described him. So I like the thought of that too. That she would have said, "Oh, it's just nonsense," But anyway,
Right. But not at the end of life because she didn't have anything
she
to
was
lose
open.
at that
There was
point,
nothing to
right?
push against. Yeah, exactly.
She wasn't trying to keep up, appearances.
Exactly. Yeah.
I had a client who was an elderly Jewish man
Hmm.
who was dying and was hanging on, hanging on, hanging on. And his wife and I were on the phone multiple times, and she said, "What the heck is going on? What does he need to go?" Well, he
Hmm.
kept telling her that he needed to see the rabbi.
Hmm.
And she said, "You haven't been inside a synagogue in
Exactly.
decades. Why do you need to see the rabbi?"
Right.
"I just need to see the rabbi. I just need to see the rabbi." So I said to her, "Get a
Catch
rabbi
the
to come
rabbi.
visit. What the heck?"
Yeah.
And he was brought up Jewish and went to
Yeah.
temple and did the high
Yeah.
holy days and
Oh.
all that jazz.
Uh-huh.
And so she found a rabbi to come visit him, and he died within a couple of hours.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that, I would love to hear your take on that. A
Mhm.
lot of that, I believe, has to do with we go back to how we were raised, and
Mhm.
that's so ingrained in us. And
Mhm.
whether you believe in all the dogma or not, the
Mhm.
spiritual part of it is there.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that's the part that stays constant and
Mhm.
remains. And
Mhm.
I believe that's what was going on with your mom
Mhm.
wanting to go to church, especially if she was raised going to
Mhm.
church.
Mhm. She wasn't.
She
No,
wasn't.
no,
Did
she
she
was
ever
raised.
go?
No, she went
Her
with my
family?
father, who was a member of the church, but she didn't relate to the structure of it and
Even
you
as a child, though? She went
no,
with your dad?
no. Her parents were communists, actually. It's an
Oh my
interesting story.
gosh.
Yeah,
Wow.
they were very interesting, sort of intellectual, but she was raised as an atheist in their household, so I think
But her
again,
dad went to church, though, you said?
my dad was a member of the church,
Oh,
yeah.
your dad, not
Yeah.
her dad.
Sorry, her husband,
Your
yeah,
dad.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Okay. So
yeah,
that spiritual
yeah.
vibe got in there somehow.
Mhm.
And that's what the part with which she was resonating at the end. And
Yes.
that's what propelled her and led her
Mhm.
to want
Mhm.
to go to church.
Yeah, it's
And
interesting.
all of the dogma and nonsense that's come down through the ages with every religion
Right.
goes by the wayside because
Mhm.
they all were founded on this spiritual component. And
Mhm.
that's what we focus on, and not
Mhm.
so much the human
Yeah,
side of the
right,
equation of what the humans
right.
have
Yeah,
put in.
that's interesting.
Changing topics a little bit. I love the story about the child who wanted to remember her daddy's kisses.
Oh,
Can
yeah,
you tell us about that? And also
yeah.
tell us, how can we involve children
Mm.
when somebody that they love has a terminal illness? And does it make sense to involve them in some kind of a funeral or remembrance ceremony?
Yeah, I don't think children are scared, actually. It's usually they pick that up from the parents or the family. So I think naturally they're curious, especially the younger kids, until they've got these layers of fear built in. But so I always encourage families to include the children and ask them if they want to come into the room, and they know. They'll say no, or I could, and then you might say, well, if I came with you, or, and they say yes. So that, again, this intelligence of children, I think we overprotect, of course, because that's our nature. But I think children have a natural curiosity. So a lot of the families I've worked with, and it's really sad when you're working with young parents who are dying and they have young children. I mean, it is really, I would say, the hardest part of my work. But I'm so moved, like this family that I wrote about. It was very moving because he came to see me, her father, and he wanted her to just wait in the waiting room and I could lock that door. And so she brought her coloring books and everything. And so I said, just knock on the door if you want to come in. And she was fine. She was about 8. And so we were talking, her dad and I, and then the little knock came, and I thought, of course she wants to come in. She wants to know what we're talking about. So she sat down beside him and she said, what are you talking about? And I looked at him to see, and he looked at me kind of, you speak, you say. I said, well, we're talking about your daddy. He has cancer. And she said, yeah, and he's going to die, just like that. So he was quite surprised. You see how much children already know, because he didn't think, he hadn't really talked to them about that. So right off the bat, that we got into this conversation about, and it was very beautiful to see, him actually be led along by her, because she, and then that's where I introduced this idea of a memory box, which I've worked with children with, where you, before the person dies, you sit together and you say, well, let's talk about the memories that you're going to have after, because all the things you've done with your daddy in these 8 years, you've got, those are going to be really important to you. And so that's what she, we started to talk about putting, well, I want to put this in, daddy, and I want to put a piece of your clothes, it's just so beautiful. And then she said, and I want to put your kisses in. Of course, that dissolved both of us, her dad and I, and then I said, so ask them, how do you think we could put his kisses in? I wouldn't have had a clue what to say. I would have maybe fumbled around. Again, we can't get into the world of the child's imagination that easily. And she was the one who said, well, daddy, you could put lipstick, mummy's lipstick on, and then you could kiss paper, and then I could cut out the paper and we could put the kisses in the box. And I honestly just, I could not hold back. That was such a moving moment, and he just got carried along. So I really believe that kids can be helped to be okay with all of it. And it's dependent a bit on the child. If the child has a sort of anxiety, history of anxiety, you have to be very careful in the pacing. But I always say to adults, parents or grandparents, just to talk about things, you have to pace it. And it's true with us. So when there's news, when there's a change, maybe the treatment's not working anymore, or there might be a new treatment, then that's a time to tell them. So they have to build up trust that what you'll do is you'll tell them things as you go along. So what most adults do with kids is they wait too long. So the kids haven't been part of the process. So they may know that the parent had cancer, like in this situation, but they don't know the degree to which, how ill the person is. And what you don't want to do is to go too far ahead to say, oh, well, this, I'm going to die and, the doctor's given me a prognosis. You don't want to give too much, because children can't really manage that like 6 months from now. I'm talking about young kids. So you give them enough information, and usually when they're satisfied, they'll stop asking the questions. But the fact that they're asking questions is a good sign. Some kids just don't ask anything. Those are the parents that are most worried. Well, how are they feeling, and what are they? So you have to give them a chance, through play or through other ways to express themselves. But I have watched so many parents and their young kids, or even older teenagers, just find a way to say goodbye, because that's the regret afterwards if you haven't been able to, with enormous courage. And I can't judge parents or grandparents who can't do this, because it is really a big thing to be able to tell your young people that you're going to die, and that that you will carry them with you, whatever your faith tradition is, whatever your beliefs, find a way to reassure them that you're okay, and that you will always be in the family in a certain way. And find your own stories about that make sense. If it's heaven, that's helpful for kids to know there's a place. But I think that children do really well if they're in the know. I think kids I see who really struggle are kids who have not been brought in, and then things happen quickly in their view, because it probably wasn't happening that quickly. But then they get brought in the last few days, and it's really traumatic then, because they haven't had the chance for their little systems, energetic systems, to calibrate to this leaving, although they know it. So again, it sets up a lot of tension, I think, when there's pretense that, oh, everything's, I'm gonna be fine. I mean, parents say that, and there they are living with this very serious situation that the kids, I know many of them, they ask me sometimes, is mommy going to die? And it's just shocking when out of the blue you're asked that question, because they want validation really for what they already know. And then they get into the young ones get into their imagination. Well, where's she going to go? And I'll say, well, where do you think? And they'll say, well, up there, up there, way beyond the clouds. This little boy said that to me. And I said, oh, what do you think it'll be like there? And he said, oh, I think it'll be fun. I hope she gets to play baseball. Like, of course, this little world of his. So, oh, well, I think that would be fun. You could imagine her playing baseball up there. He goes, but how would she put a glove on? Because she wouldn't have a body. It's like such a good question. I said, good question. So I've learned so much from these little people, really. And I think if they're brought in, then they do better in their grieving as well, because they've already got some capacity, to be allowed to feel and to feel sad and to be part of the funeral. I mean, I think I wasn't able to go. I wasn't allowed to go to my grandfather's funeral. And it was such a strange feeling, because why wouldn't I be able to go? And it was, the circumstances of his death were very difficult. But I was an early teen, and I thought, that doesn't make any sense to me. And I think kids, why wouldn't I be included? Again, going back over centuries, children, babies, everybody goes to these funerals or wakes. And so I think kids do much better if we can be courageous and help them to understand what's happening and what illness is, and alleviate some of the myths they have, about catching it, or, that they did something wrong. There's a lot of those kind of magical thinking. Kids feel really responsible for things that have happened. Yeah.
That's why I wrote my series of children's books,
Oh,
because I had so many moms over the
yeah.
years say, can you help me explain to my child what happens when somebody dies? And how
Yeah.
can my child know things about my grandfather who
Mhm.
passed before he was born, but he describes my grandfather's spirit in the room with him. And my grandfather tells him things that there's no way my child would
Yeah.
know. And
Yeah.
how does my child know about past life
Mhm.
stuff that we can corroborate with historic documents online? And this kid can't read yet. And so that's why
Amazing.
I wrote my children's book series, was to help with that. Back
Yeah.
to your memory box. Here's something else that I think pertains. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking with a client who was in her probably late 30s, I would imagine, and her
Mhm.
grandfather had just passed, and her grandfather and grandmother raised her.
Mhm.
So it was like she was losing her parent. And we were talking to the grandfather's spirit, my client and I, which people find so comforting when
Mhm.
they can communicate with their deceased loved ones.
Mhm.
And I teach them how to do that. And then
Yeah.
I do that to help them along.
Yeah.
So, anyways, the grandfather was telling her about, he was talking about a box, and he was talking about keys. And she said, can he send me a sign, or can he let me know that this is really him? And I said, well, he's talking about a box. He's talking about keys. Well, she said, that doesn't mean anything to me. So later on in the conversation, she said, well, my grandfather started this box for me, and he has all kinds of little trinkets and
Mhm.
rocks and little whatever in there that he's put in there my whole life.
Oh.
And she said, and the thing that's so interesting is he has this set of antique keys in there. And I'm saying, duh, the box and the keys. And
Oh.
she started laughing, and she said, oh my God, you're right.
Oh.
And so the memory box thing, I think, not only has connotation with somebody's making that for me,
Mhm. Mhm.
but also when spirit's communicating with their loved one who's still
Mhm.
alive, they can reference the stuff that's in
Oh.
the box, like
Oh.
this spirit did with his grandfather or with his granddaughter
Right.
who's still
Right.
alive,
Oh.
and referenced a couple of things that were in the
That's
box itself.
amazing. Oh,
So I thought
so
that
affirming.
it made
Yeah.
me think of that when you were
Yeah.
talking about the
Yeah.
memory box. Yeah. Why do some people have a tough time enjoying the person while they're still with us? And instead, they're so ensconced in what I call anticipatory grief.
Mhm. Yeah.
They, it's like, wake
Mhm.
up, Francis.
Mhm.
You've
Mhm.
got your loved ones still here.
Mhm.
Let's enjoy them while they're here.
Mhm.
Certainly you can have a relationship with them when they're in spirit, but how do you move somebody off that anticipatory grief? Because we all do that. We all
Mhm.
have thoughts that are leading us to, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? And how are we going to get through this? And how are we going to do this?
Mhm.
Even to the point where, how would we do their funeral?
Mhm. Yeah. I've had many people like that too, and it's kind of, yeah, you wanna, like, say, "Wake up." this, it's not going to be long. And people are very, again, they're so what would I say about that? I think that I have to say people bring their personalities to the end of life with them. So I would say that you can almost predict who might be that way, who feel that their life's, in a way being interfered with, and they want to move on, that they want to get this over with. But part of anticipatory grief is, I want to be on the other side of it. I'm grieving now, and let's just get this on the road because I want to. And it's not conscious like that, but there's a sense of, this is too difficult. I want to get past this and get back to some semblance of my life. Of course, what they don't understand is that the grief that will accompany them after is not going to be like any life they've had before. But there is this sort of, again, a kind of personality that finds it very hard to drop into the reality of separation. I see this especially with couples who've been together a long time, where it just is, I think of it as being kind of fused as one energy, and so this idea of separation is kind of impossible and very, very painful and hard to actually get to in conversation. I mean, these are often people who can't talk about this fact that this will be us separating in the physical form. So I do think anticipatory grief is often anxious people have that more because that's a habit pattern of anxiety. So, they're kind of ahead, like I think of myself as I love planning, I've got my little year-long planner. I'm always liking my future, and that's partly, I remember on a meditation retreat, a voice in my head said, you've missed your life because you're ahead of yourself. So I recognize that with people who go very quickly into it's all over. And yes, it will be over, but not, as you said, not right now. It's not. You're
Yeah.
here. And people say some interesting things, but I just want, it can be quite harsh because it's almost like the person's being dismissed already, and people often, they feel that. Yeah, I want you to get on with your life, but not quite yet.
How do you counsel somebody that's feeling that to pull themselves back and be present with
Yeah.
their loved one while they're still alive? Do
Well, I
you
have
do
to
you
say,
have a technique that you
yeah, I wish
use
I
or
did.
suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, I really feel that that's I would say that that's quite difficult because we hold, those structures are pretty strong, inside a person. So I think the only way is to help people more deeply into the sorrow. And that isn't always the defenses are strong, so I think I've probably succeeded less times than I failed in that regard, because I think then I have to honor, this is how this person has to go through this in some way, because I want, like you, I want it to be, and I've tried all sorts of ways, like you said, just like this is, and I remember saying to this couple, like, he's actually dying, it's kind of how pointed, but that didn't even penetrate. So there's not a lot that can penetrate except when you can get them by themselves and try and soften the defenses. And then when you can get them, because often there are people they're in the anticipatory grief, but that's actually a mental process. Worry, worry, worry. It's not a visceral sorrow or fear. Like the emotion is different. So if I can get people into their emotion, there are often people that don't cry that much. They're just in the worry of it. Is that your experience, or depends?
Yeah, it's a safety mechanism.
Yes,
They're
exactly.
trying, they're afraid not
Yes,
only of losing their loved one, but
yeah,
it makes them face their own
right,
mortality as
exactly.
well.
Yeah.
And in our Judeo-Christian culture,
Hmm.
they're afraid, are they going to fly or are they going to fry?
Right.
And,
Yeah.
I find that people are very afraid of going to hell or
Yeah.
purgatory or whatever their belief is.
Right.
And that causes so much
Yeah.
unnecessary
Yeah.
fear,
Right. So it
which
gets
is
clouds everything, as you said. Yeah.
right, which I've tried to allay
Hmm.
those fears
Hmm.
with my angelic attendance book.
Yeah.
Well, Yeah, it's definitely something that I see a lot and have experienced myself
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
loved ones at the
Yeah.
end of their lives.
Yeah.
How important is ritual, and how it seems like people have moved away in some instances from our traditional
Mm-hmm.
funerals and
Mm-hmm.
wakes.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that there are ramifications for that. Are you seeing that as well? How important is it to have
Mm-hmm.
some kind of a ritual or remembrance?
Yeah, I mean, I that's going to be my next book. Actually, I'm writing about ceremony because I think it's extremely helpful because within the ceremony you get a sense of the whole. Really, I mean, I think that's what that's one way of describing that. So whatever the ceremony is, it can be a tiny gesture, but it does give you your view expands. And so I think if people come from faith traditions, I mean, it's very comforting for people and so helpful. The Jewish people that I know, they just have the rituals laid out. There's nothing to decide. It's really, there's obviously things to decide, but not really. Like, it's so comforting. So I think when people are not involved in a faith tradition, then people are wanting ceremony now and wanting somehow how do you do that? And I'm personally really interested in that because I think it's extremely helpful. And again, children love ceremony. So we've done and we're doing more and more ceremony here, also around healing ceremony for people, because, how do you do that release of the fear and the anxiety and these stories that I've talked about? I think the ceremony can come through all sorts of times during that trajectory of our life, not just at the weddings, funerals. I think there's ceremony, it's innate in us. I think I really believe that we can, if we can find ceremony inside. So actually I'm in the process of designing a retreat for September where we're doing 8 personal ceremonies for people who are at very varying stages, but 2 or 3 of them have they're really working with the end of life and what could that ceremony look like so that they can be somewhat empowered, because I think ceremony is very empowering. In so many ways, you just get a sense of yourself in the whole, whether it's with your community, whether it's with a candle, whether it's with flowers or a tree. Or so I think I'm watching how it's becoming more and more. People are talking about it more. Ceremonies sort of becoming, but I think it's necessary. I would say I think it's necessary, and I'm so moved by it. What can happen within a sacred space, however you create that. And it can be created really anywhere. It can be created in a hospital room, it can be created in, anywhere we can create sacred space if we have the parameters for that. So I'm very interested in how we create the conditions for sacred space. It's easy when there's a building, a church, but not so easy when, you don't have that to fall back on. So how do we create a sense of the sacred, which to me is really a necessary and helpful thing? But a lot of people choose not to. And, again, we can't judge that as being, it's not right or wrong, but I do see how people fall into the ceremony as a way of, I belong somehow to my life, to a bigger life, to everything. And I find it, it's probably the most reassuring thing we can do is to be in ceremony and be in community or be in a tiny little ceremony, which is your own. So we had a young mom come and she wanted to do a ceremony for, basically she was dying and leaving her baby, which was a 1-year-old, and she wanted to bring her closest women friends and just be able to embrace her sorrow and her grief about. And it was beautiful. She set up an altar with photographs and writings that she'd done, and she had these 4 very close friends, and she just was able to go into the heart of the matter, and I think the sacred circle can hold that in a way that is difficult when you're just having a conversation per se from the cognitive space. I think that the heart space opens in us in a sacred space, and we need that so much, don't we? We just need that connection to the heart space so that we can feel ourselves in the midst of it. So Yeah.
Well,
So
I've found it, and I'm sure you probably have too. I've found that when people are involved in planning
yeah.
their own ceremonies, whether it's while they're still alive or
Mm-hmm.
after they've passed,
Mm-hmm.
it brings to mind my younger sister, Joan,
Mm-hmm.
who died very unexpectedly in 2010 of a cerebral aneurysm
Wow.
that ruptured and
Oh,
was on a vent for several
yeah.
days. And we took her off the vent and she passed. Well,
Mm-hmm.
within an hour, my brother-in-law Regis came out I was in the waiting area out. She was in an ICU and we were
Mm-hmm.
waiting for the funeral home to come get her body. And he said, she's always wanted ornaments, Christmas ornaments given at her funeral to everybody that attends. And I said, what? And he said, she's told me this for 15 years. She wants everybody to get a Christmas
Oh,
ornament to
right.
remember her by. And he said, can you handle that?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, okay, first of all, I don't live in town. I haven't lived
Right.
here for decades.
Right.
Secondly, she died on a Wednesday morning. The wake started at Friday afternoon, less than 48 hours
Yeah.
later. And I'm thinking, okay, how am I going to get, because I knew it was going to be a mob scene.
Right.
So I came up with 350 baby pink glass ornaments with her initials painted on them with a white bow. And
Oh,
on either side of her casket were Christmas trees that were 6 feet tall, pre-lit with these ornaments on them. And we said to and we buried her on her 50th birthday, which was awful.
oh,
So I said, everybody, you take an ornament. And then I had one of the other parlors in the funeral home.
yeah.
We had these huge sheet cakes for a birthday party, and everybody got a piece of birthday cake.
Love
And
it.
then the ornaments that were
Mm.
left over, I had big baskets. And so I had her nieces be hostesses at the funeral, and they would give a program and they gave an ornament to anybody that hadn't gotten one. Well, all these years later, Janie, I have people every year at Christmas time say
And
that their Joni ornament was the first one they put on the
that's
tree.
so beautiful.
So,
That lives on. Yeah. These
yeah.
songs.
And I have a tree in my kitchen. Of
Mm.
course, I took the ornaments that I wanted first
Right.
because I thought, what the heck? I'm doing this. I might as well take it myself.
Yeah.
But it's in the corner of my kitchen in this beautiful
Um,
planter. It's lit. It's got
Mm.
about 20 of her ornaments on there, and
Oh,
it's up all year round.
beautiful.
So that's an example of her. She didn't know she was dying. I mean, it was very unexpected. And so but her husband said, she's said this
Always
for
said
15 years. I'm thinking, what's up with that? But
But
boy, did she know what
uh,
an impact that would have
that's
on
beautiful.
people for the rest of their lives, as long as they're
So,
putting up Christmas trees.
uh,
And some of her friends tell me that they just have them hanging,
yeah.
in a room or in a window or on a mirror or
Wow.
something like that.
What a
So
beautiful story. Thank you for sharing.
yeah, something about that.
Mm.
In your book, you talk about a pot of whales.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us about that story and tell us how it applies to everything that we've been discussing.
Right. It's such a, yeah. So I think it's such a beautiful story. And it's in the books. I won't tell it in detail, but yes, this woman was having to go and have a very intense conversation with her surgeon where she was going to have her leg amputated, and she was very, very bereft. She was in her 50s at the time, and maybe just 60. And so she was on the ferry with her husband, and they were going over from Salt Spring Island over to Vancouver, and she was just in a really despairing place, and she overheard on the loudspeaker of the ferry that there was a pod of orcas off the starboard side of the ferry. And of course, when that happens, everybody jumps up and goes and watches this spectacle, just gorgeous, living on the West Coast. And she said for the first time ever, she couldn't get out of her seat. She was just in a real mess. And her husband said, come on, and then she felt this kind of pull. It was like something pulled her up out of the seat. Not him, but, like she felt, I have to go. So she went out and she watched this pod. There's a resident pods around in the Pacific Northwest here. And there was this just beautiful generations of little babies, and they were just dancing, and right off the ferry, close to the ferry. And so later, when I talked to her after she'd had her appointment and she'd gone through, and she said, I got through that appointment like I felt like I was fine. And he was telling me I was going to have this amputation. And she said, I was showing him these yoga poses with one leg and how I was really quite well equipped to have this done. She said, I completely surprised myself. And she said, I really believe that visitation of the whales, that it, she said it wasn't about me calling them in. The fact that they were there, she said, just completely changed my view. And she said, and I had a whole experience of these generations of people and animals along the West Coast who have lived and died. I mean, she just had this sort of one of those openings, I believe, like a portal to say, oh, this is life, death, it's all here. And she said it just calmed her whole system down so that she could enter into this conversation about her cancer and how they were going to treat it. And actually, a great little end to that story. She's the one person in the book that's actually living. The other people in the book have died, but she sent me a text the other day and said, I'm just celebrating my 90th birthday. So she's actually, she learned how to live with this, and she's, that's, to me, nature responds. I do find that it's happened a lot in my life. Nature responds at times where I'm really, just feel like I need some backup somehow. But I'm not saying come to me, but nature seems to know, I find anyway, that it knows what to do. So that story to me was such I don't know, it's a real tribute, I think, to the fact we're connected and that we do belong to lineages, and we will come here for a time and then we'll leave. And what a blessing to be here, and a blessing to have this beautiful interconnectedness with, this natural world and with each other. So yeah, thank you for that's a precious story to my heart. Yeah.
I agree on the nature teaches us and animals teach us. Anybody that's ever euthanized a beloved pet, oh my gosh, is that draining for when you're with a loved one who's dying? I believe that it is, because it's excruciating, and the grieving process can be equally excruciating as when losing a loved one who's a person. I had a woman call into my show last night who was going to euthanize her. She and her husband were euthanizing his horse today, the next day. And I told her a story about how I had read that wild horses do this ritual called breathing air. Have you ever heard of this?
No.
Where if in the wild, if a horse is dying, the other horses will very reverently come and put their nose next to the dying horse's nose, and they call it breathing air. And I said to her, I had read a story about Mustangs, wild Mustangs doing that. And she said, well, the other horse is in the barn with the horse who's dying. She said, my horse is a Mustang. And I said, well, take your horse into his stall. And let them breathe air, because they know as a species how to do that. And she was just so moved by that. I even wrote a blog on it last year about breathing air. And to your point, I agree. I think nature and animals really can teach us so much about how to put a humane and an elegant patina on such an excruciating experience. And then from the spiritual side, to know that your loved one is surrounded by angels and the spirits of deceased loved ones and pets. And that brings so much comfort to the dying person and also the family. I just have talked
to animals I've seen after someone's died, and after they've even left the house, or the animals go and they walk around, they can feel, the imprint, I would call it. Yeah, it's really beautiful. Just a quick story. It's funny, when I was walking here this morning, I remembered the story, and it was about horses. And it was a woman I knew quite well, and she called me maybe a year ago and said, I've had a new diagnosis and I'd like to see you. And we had some very beautiful time together. And she told me about a dream that she'd had where she was standing on a beach. It was one of these big, beautiful, vacant beaches. And she was on her own. And in the far distance, she saw a herd of white horses. And then she realized they were coming towards her and they were galloping down this beach. And she said, I knew I had to just stand and let them come through me, come. And she said, I wasn't frightened. And these horses came galloping right through, and she felt herself being embraced in the herd. She just got swept along with that. It was so touching to me. And I said to her, well, then that's your meditation, in these last days, just to imagine you being swept along in that, the wild horse. It's just so touching. So I think that these animals can come in our dreams as well. They can come in all ways. So it's lovely, isn't it, to feel that there's this connection, whether it's outside of us or inside of us.
I agree. Couple more questions, then we'll wrap this up. What can family, friends, and non-medical caregivers do to support a person who has a cancer diagnosis, whether it be terminal or not? Mm-hmm. Because the big cancer, the big C, seems to be the thing that's the scariest. And it seems that it's more common, it's more prevalent. I heard last week on an interview that 1,700 people die from cancer in the U.S. every day.
Oh, wow.
1,700. Yeah. And are you finding it's more prevalent? And what can we do to support our loved ones who receive that diagnosis or support ourselves?
Right. Well, I think it is more prevalent. It's, I think 1 in 3, 1 in 2 or 3 people now are going to probably have cancer in their lifetime. The good news about that is that the treatments, there are many cancers now and this new shift towards this individualized cancer treatment is really moving fast. So there's a lot of hope in the new treatments that are coming. So I think from a more of a psychological or psycho-spiritual perspective with people, I think the biggest thing I hear from people about their families and what they do right and what they do wrong is that, first of all, their anxiety and worry starts to, as happens, people start to tell them what to do. So you've got to do this and you have to do this, and they've got a whole list of supplements, and people email them like, you've got to get on this wonder drug or this wonder supplement. And so we invade so much. Our anxiety makes us invade people's space, so they can't even find their own way. So as a family member, and I've certainly gone through this, my father had a stage 4 brain tumor and died within 16 weeks of being diagnosed at 67. So I certainly know this from a personal perspective as well. You just want to help. So your instinct is to move toward and then get them sorted, and we get over controlling in a sense. And I think that's really harmful. I think that we give too much advice. We get, because we want it to go okay. So I think that I would say hold back, become a better listener. It's one of the things our retreat teaches people. Just listen, really, just listen. A lot of the time they don't need the add-on of you should, take the word should from your vocabulary. But I often say, ask your person, what do you want me to do? How best to help? We think we know our loved ones, but actually in a situation that you've never been in before, you don't necessarily know what to do to help them or support them. So do you want me to do research for you? Because, maybe you don't want to, find out more information about things you could do to help yourself. And the person might say yes or no, but again, you can't necessarily predict. I don't think my husband or wife would want to do that, to find out more stats. Other people go immediately to the computer and Google everything and then get themselves overwhelmed. So I think you're looking at it as, how can I relieve the stress from the situation? How can I bring comfort? How can I bring, warmth and connection? And I think that you really as a supporter, you're having your own experience. And I think the biggest thing you can do for your loved one is to take your own experience somewhere else, in the sense that you can, for the time being, when this new diagnosis has happened. So the person you normally would turn to would be your person who's going through this diagnosis. So for a time, I suggest that, you find someone else to share your deepest worries and fears with, because the person who's had the diagnosis already has those. They already have their own fears and worries. They don't need you to add on to that in the beginning, because it's just too much. And then they start to feel they have to take care of you. And so I think that it's wise to get a counselor, friend, walk with a friend every day and just be able to share how hard it is. So I think at the beginning, later on, it becomes easier to share both experiences. This is, if you want to hear about my experience as a supporter, it's a powerful thing to be able to share what it was like, but not at the beginning. It's too much, it's overwhelming. So I think your job is really to provide comfort and be creative. And someone says, I just don't feel like eating, then you get creative about maybe what kinds of food would be helpful. And so emotionally, you're trying to, in hypnosis is a wonderful term it's about mirroring. So I always say to people, mirror what's in front of you. So if the person is quiet and wants to just be, just still or rest, or just mirror that so that you can give them the space to be that. If they're feeling suddenly they've got energy, don't say, I think you should rest. Go with the energy. So then, should we go out? Should we take a drive? Should we take a walk? So match and mirror the energy that's present. And that's being heard and seen. And the person will feel so supported by that. And I really love that in my own life, to say, okay, I don't need to override, or make, just try and go with what's happening. And it can make us frightened. What if the person wants to stay in bed all day? Well, is that really going to harm anyone? If it was weeks of that, yes, then we might need an intervention. But mostly people know what they need. Their bodies know what they need through treatment, and just kind of hold steady. That's as best you can. It's not easy because you're also, struggling and grieving. So, but I think the family can create such a beautiful, steady, holding space that allows the person to be able to process their feelings, and just, even if people say to me, well, they're not talking about how they feel. Well, just let it be. Sometimes you just have to do it inside. Some people, as process internally, and then they'll start to talk perhaps. But at the beginning, that survival instinct, they've just got to get through the practical side. Some people get very irritated and angry, and family members say, what am I supposed to do? This person's being a real pain. Well, I'd say, well, put your boundaries in, you should anyway. So you don't have to be a different person. You don't have to be the best caregiver that ever lived. You're human as well. So you can bring your own boundaries to that. Say, right now, I think I'm going to just let you rest because I'm not enjoying this conversation. I'm not enjoying this kind of where we're going with this. So let's just cool it, rather than getting into it. That's probably the only time. Don't match it because it's not helpful. We do that so easily, don't we? Ignite things. So anyway, so I hope that's helpful. There's lots.
Yeah, very helpful. Very helpful. You, in closing, you have mentioned several times that you hold retreats several times a year. Please tell us about those. And then also, is there another treasured memory from those retreats that you can share? You mentioned the one woman who came, but is there another one? And can anybody come to them, or is it only for Canadians?
Right. Well, because we take just such a small number of people, we take 8 people per retreat, so we can really go deep. So, and we do 5 retreats a year. So we do have a limit to the number of people. So we have said, because there are 5 other retreat programs in the US, one being Commonweal, if you go to the Commonweal website, which is weal.org, they tell you that the other retreats in the US, and these are all modeled with the same principles. We've made it our own. We're the only one in Canada, so I could never say only Canadians. I don't work that way. But so it would again, people can connect, but there aren't a lot of spaces, so it's good to look at the other programs available in the US, and there's some wonderful programs. Smith Center in Washington State, wonderful center, and there's others. So the retreats are a 5-night, and they're really, again, as I said, for people to come and explore what it means to have cancer, what it means to live with cancer, what it means to die from cancer. And we have people with all types of cancer and all stages of cancer. And we take them through a wonderful process that includes contemplative practice. It includes wonderful food. It includes body work and massage and art and music, and then some group work. So we've created it around what I think of as these conditions for healing. And I think those are what we've been talking about, really: nature, silence, movement of the body, ingesting wonderful food, non-prescriptive in a way. There's some things you can't eat. No, well, there's ways to eat all the things that are like treats as well, So good food, body work, art, and the music is all these conditions. I think they're universal conditions for people. And then within the context of those retreats, you then can find your unique conditions for healing, that these kind of emerge as the week goes on. Oh, I just love pulling up a chair and sitting by the creek. I've never done that. That's such a helpful thing. How to decompress your nervous system. So the retreats, I think, are sort of a deep immersion in work that you can do outside of retreat with the right people, to have people that can help you find those spaces and work with these, what I think of as these conditions for healing. And there's so many stories of people. And the one that just popped into my head is a fairly recent story, a young woman in her late 30s dealing with stage 4 breast cancer, and had been for a long time, has lived a long time with it. And she told me that she was really carrying generations of pain from her family history. And because breast cancer had gone through her family line. And she was very interested in genealogy. So she basically, all these people, her grandmother and her aunt and her cousin, all had this genetic breast cancer. And she said, I just need to do my own work, but I seem to have all these people. It's interesting in terms of the work you do. She was just carrying. So she said, I feel like I need to go to the creek and I need to get a river rock for each one of my relatives. And I need to lay them in the creek bed together. And I need to bless them. And I need to say thank you. And I need to say this, I need to have my life. And I need you to, be laid to rest. So she did that, and it was very beautiful. And then she asked us to plant crocuses in the forest. It's a Pacific Northwest forest, so I didn't know if they'd take, but we all then planted them as a symbol of spring. And it was very, very beautiful. And then she actually, interestingly enough, sent me a photograph of the next morning. She had gone and done a sort of little prayer in that space where she laid down the ancestors. And she sent me a photograph, which she didn't see at the time, but you know how sometimes you can see things in photos. And there were two things she saw. One was a mist was in the photograph, like kind of a fog around her. And the other one was a column of light that came right down from the trees and landed at the side of her head, which is where the brain tumor was that had. And she said, "What is that?" And I said, "Well, you tell me." I mean, that was so amazing. So again, these ways that nature, I'm more and more, I'm fascinated by that. So what it did for her is it comforted her deeply that somehow there was this invisible world that was, coming to support her. It was very, very beautiful. So those are the things that happen that are surprising and, of course, sustaining in so many ways.
Well, and it wraps it back around to one of my first questions with King Arthur's court, the lady in the lake. What? The lady in the lake with the mist and the beams of light that were coming in. And they've found references. There's a gal who's a historic fiction author named Signe Pike, Pike, and she writes about Arthurian legend, and she goes and she finds historic references for all the stuff from the Arthurian legends, and it's all in Scotland. And the Lady in the Lake, she's got how that evolved and where it happened and all of this other stuff. It's
Oh,
fascinating
wonderful. I'll have to
to
read more
read that.
about that again. I haven't
Ah,
watched
yeah,
that.
but that's the first image that came in
Right,
my
Janie
mind when you were
Brown, that's
describing. I'm
beautiful.
thinking the Lady in the Lake. And so we're
Oh,
wrapping it up with where
yeah,
we began this conversation. How can
beautiful.
people get in touch with you? How can they learn more about you and your work?
Well, through my book, obviously, which you've mentioned, Radical Acts of Love. So that's what it looks like. That is really a lot about the work and not just the retreats, but the work. And then our website, which is callanish.org. So it's callanish.org. And that will give you lots of newsletters. There's a blog on there. There's a whole lot of information. And I think it's information there's poems and just that can actually nurture and nourish people, regardless of whether they get to Vancouver, so yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I think you're extraordinary and the work you're doing is extraordinary. And I'm sure there's a canonization process that's begun to make you a saint after
So,
you pass. So, you know,
thank
your
you.
your atheist communist mother will be
Yeah,
thrilled
exactly.
when you're canonized.
Thank you. Well,
So,
I just want to thank you for your beautiful mission of service and help to people. I mean, it's quite remarkable. I just loved learning about you, and thank you. I mean, I just feel it's lovely to meet in this space, and hopefully we can, our joint conversation could be of help.
absolutely. All righty, everybody. I'll see you next time. Sending you lots of love from Sweet Home, Alabama. Mwah! And from Canada, too, from Janie.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Yeah. Bye, everyone. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to follow Julie on Instagram and YouTube at Ask Julie Ryan and like her on Facebook at Ask Julie Ryan. To schedule an appointment or submit a question, please visit AskJulieRyan.com.
This show is for informational purposes only. It is not intended to be medical, psychological, financial, or legal advice. Please contact a licensed professional. The Ask Julie Ryan Show, Julie Ryan and all parties involved in producing, recording, and distributing it assume no responsibility for listeners' actions based on any information heard on this or any Ask Julie Ryan shows or podcasts.